Wildlife Conservation Society owns 4 zoos in New York and an aquarium. And we basically have 4 million visitors a year coming to those institutions. And so it's a very important education place in the New York area. But the second arm of WCS is a global conservation agency, effectively. We work in 47 countries, 71 landscapes, and have over 3,000 staff. So, and the latest figures show that we're probably working in about areas that contain about 25% of the world's biodiversity. So adaptation for WCS really means 3 things. We really want to tease out an understanding of vulnerability for species, for ecosystems, and for human communities in the landscapes and skyscapes that we work in. We really want to understand why species and ecosystems and humans are vulnerable to climate change. And the second thing is to engage planning frameworks which utilise the data from these vulnerability assessments to think through what is the best strategies to overcome this vulnerability. And the third stage is obviously implementation. What can we then do once we do this science to actually, and do this planning, what can we do actually to ensure that adaptation actions occur on the ground? So that's basically our vision when we think about adaptation. Now, over the past couple of years, we've really been thinking through a little bit more of actually what does vulnerability mean to species, to ecosystems, and for humans. And we really thought there's actually really 4 ways we've got to plan for climate adaptation. When you think about species conservation in particular, you've got to think through the direct impacts of climate change, and that is how climate changes are going to affect the vulnerability of the species directly. So effectively what Wendy spoke about before. We've got to understand the vulnerability of those species and then understand planning regimes to overcome that vulnerability. But probably more importantly, and I see this day to day, I travel through WCS's landscapes and seascapes quite regularly, and I see it's the indirect impacts of climate change. And that is how humans are responding to climate change. It's becoming a bigger issue in WCS landscapes. So understanding how humans are responding to climate change in the landscapes and seascapes that we work in, and trying to plan for this. So on the y-axis here, we're really thinking through indirect and direct impacts of biodiversity. We also are recognising that climate change isn't just a continuous change that we're seeing across our landscapes. And so we just don't want to do long-term forecasting, thinking through, well, what is the species, and what is ecosystems, and what are humans going to be doing in 50 to 100 years. We realise that continuous change is important. We've got to think through that. But another important element, which I think is very much forgotten in a lot of conservation planning literature, is the discrete, sudden impacts which are occurring right now or in the next 5 to 10 years, which are going to actually affect the species and ecosystems that we work in. So we break the planning into 4 discrete parts, recognising though that in each landscape we've got to think through all 4 components. Now this is confusing. I thought what I'd do is actually go through 4 examples of WCS work throughout the world, looking at each of these examples in turn. So the first example I'm going to give you is an example of thinking through a direct impact on biodiversity over the long term. So think, how does WCS deal with that? And I think a really good example of our work is on the Yellowstone cutthroat trout in North America. So this trout has been shown by science, WCS scientists as well as government scientists, to be extremely vulnerable over the long term. In 50 to 100 years' time, this species may go extinct. And the reason why is that they need high elevation locations for refugia. And where we're working at the moment is in the low elevation. So we're working in the wrong spots to save this species. So our models show that we've got to change our actions to move to high elevation areas and really talk to irrigators in the Yellowstone area to actually ensure that those high elevation streams are left intact. And if they've been degraded, to actually restore those high elevation streams. So this is a good example of actually thinking through what is a species vulnerable to climate change, what is the long-term impacts of climate change on it, and what are the direct impacts of climate change, and what can we do on the ground to actually ensure the species is able to survive. And we've spent the last 5 years at WCS thinking through this with this species and putting up strategies to overcome this challenge. A second example is thinking through a direct impact on biodiversity, but a discrete change, a sudden climate change event, such as a flood or a drought, which will happen in the short term. And I think a nice example of WCS work is their work on jaguars in Guatemala, in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. We are seeing in the Maya Biosphere Reserve far more fires than we've seen in the recent past. And these fires are naturally caused mostly, and it's caused through more droughts in this region. So it's a discrete climate change event that is occurring in this landscape. And what we're doing there is mapping the fires, where the fire risk is throughout this landscape, and also then working with local communities to develop fire breaks, to develop solutions when a fire occurs to actually put out the fire in the most rapid a way possible. But it's a good example of actually thinking through a discrete threat, that is, in this case, drought-caused fire, and planning with local communities a way to actually overcome a direct threat to a species, and that is the fire is affecting the prey base for the jaguars, and therefore it's affecting jaguar populations. So they're two examples of how we're thinking continuous and discrete ways of affecting, directly affecting biodiversity. But as I mentioned before, I think a lot of my colleagues think the same way. It's the indirect impacts of climate change on biodiversity is going to cause the most harm. It's how humans are going to respond to climate change in the landscapes and seascapes that we work that will cause the most harm to our biodiversity. And we've really got to start thinking through that in a far more pragmatic way. An example of how WCS is thinking through this in the Albertine Rift in Africa, I think is a very nice example of planning. Now, for those who don't know the Albertine Rift, it's one of the most biodiverse places in Africa. It holds charismatic species like the mountain dweller, but it also has huge human densities surrounding the parks. And the photo on the right, this is the Volcanoes National Park, and you can see the extreme edge of the boundary on this park. And what we're seeing in the last 10 or 15 years is a lot of climate refugees moving into this region as it gets hotter and hotter below in the lowlands. They're moving upland, and they're literally camping more and more on the edges of these parks. So WCS is thinking through the long-term impacts of this human change in this landscape. So what is the continuous impacts of climate change as it's drying in this landscape, as it's warming in this landscape? What is it going to have? What is it going to affect biodiversity? And what we've realised is that a lot of the corridors that we've identified, where we were trying to put restoration in between the parks and the Albertine Rift, were totally unsuitable. And they're unsuitable because they were the areas where humans were going to go. We're seeing that where we think a suitable corridor would be, there's likely to be millions of people there now or in the future because of long-term climate change events. So what we're doing is reallocating our efforts into corridors which will actually still have a chance of being there in the next 50 to 100 years. We're being proactive in our planning. And again, and we're working with governments, we're working with local communities, we're working with park wardens to ensure that our choices make sense. So it's a way of thinking through a continuous long-term climate change event, but thinking through how humans are going to change the climate change and what it means for our biodiversity. So the final box is thinking through an indirect effect of climate change, but a discrete event. So thinking through how you plan for this kind of event. And I think a nice example where I went to late last year is in Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Now, as you know, tropical islands around the world are being inundated regularly nowadays, and they're inundated through this long-term changes of sea level rise, but because there's more and more storms occurring, so discrete storm events are now inundating islands. In the areas I went to late last year, more and more people are saying that we're getting flooded regularly now. Where 10 years ago we never got flooded. Our islands were completely secure, our seawalls worked, but now monthly we get completely washed out, and people are having to migrate to different islands or migrate to the mainland. And what I came across is this structure here is a seawall which was just recently being built, and it's made out of coral reef, the reef in front of the island, which is actually where that provides their resources for food. And it also actually provides resources for shelter for this island. But the locals are blowing up their coral reef to build these walls because these discrete climate events keep on happening more and more regularly. This is clearly a catastrophe not just for the humans on the islands, because blowing up their reefs the long term affects their food resources, it actually is a catastrophe for biodiversity because they're blowing up one of the most biologically rich coral reefs on the planet. So WCS has got an AusAid grant, the Australian Foreign Aid Service grant, to think through planning with local local communities on these islands to work out where are the best locations for them to move if they have to move, and what are the best locations, or what are the best actions they can do if they want to stay. And obviously one of the actions we're trying to avoid is blowing up their coral reefs. So we try to give them ideas, engineering solutions, developing sustainable seawalls, or options for movement. It's just completely unsustainable because they're getting flooded too regularly now. But these people live on the front end of climate change. And it was really quite confronting for me to actually see that as an Australian, my government really doesn't really recognise climate change as an issue, but you fly 1 hour north and you see people on the front line suffering day to day the discrete consequences of climate change. So this is how WCS are thinking through it. But as I tried to say earlier, it's not just one or the other. We realise that thinking through the timing of the climate change event is critical, and thinking through the impacts, both direct and impact, are critical. And across all our landscapes, we're trying to do this 4-quadrant planning of actually doing adaptation on the ground. I'll end my presentation there, but if you have any questions, please email me. That's my email address. Or come approach me after this presentation or ask a question in the panel discussion. So, thank you.